what else do you think is being accomplished by the Belt and Road Initiative?
Oh, exactly. I was going to get into that because it by building infrastructure in in the global south, it creates demands for more manufactured Chinese goods. So China is investing in productive capacity. China is exporting productive capacity. So the Chinese bank is loaning money for project that gets bid on by Chinese construction companies using Chinese equipment by Chinese equipment companies, and the developing world gets ports, they get railroad, they get roads, they get power plants. So this is what China mean by win-win situation. It benefits everyone, and the aggregate result of this is more global connectivity, which in terms create more demands for trade. And because China is the world's #1 trading power, this it creates demand for Chinese manufactured goods. So this is net positive for everyone, and this is what China has committed to, and they spend upwards of $1 trillion into the Belt and Road Initiative. Whereas the U.S. is spending equivalent, if not more, on waging wars across the continents. So I think this is why right now we're seeing so much propaganda coming out from the Western MSM on Belt and Road Initiative to paint this as something bad, as some sort of nefarious Chinese debt trap diplomacy, so-called. Because, what they're really saying is all these African nations, Southeast Asian nations, they should really go to IMF and World Bank, right? Because the reality is the Chinese loans and Chinese
water?
sorry,
Sorry.
I think it might be an allergy because right now it's harvest season, so the farmers have cleared away their rice field and then burning rice stalks. And my house is in the middle of the rice field, so when the wind blows, the smokes gets gets everywhere. And so, yeah. So where was I? I was talking
Well,
about.
I mean,
Go ahead.
so for the IMF and the World Bank, from what I understand, the difference is the IMF and the World Bank have something called the Washington Consensus, which has been so named by people who are part of this Washington Consensus, where they seek to deregulate industries and privatize parts of governments. So say in a particular African country, South American nation, there is certain forests that are national forests. The IMF and the World Bank, in giving loans in tranches, in each tranche, they'll say, okay, you need to deregulate this market or privatize this market. And one of the things that China does in the Belt and Road Initiative in giving similar loans to the IMF is that China does not seek to interfere in the internal economic and political situations of these nations. So if I am a nation and I'm developing, if the difference is if I take a loan out from the IMF, they're going to ask me to change the internal structure of my economic and political reality for the people and for my government. Whereas China will just say, we'll help you build a bridge. And that means we're going to help you build a bridge. And yeah, you may owe 2 or 3% to China, or you may owe 2 or 3% to the IMF or World Bank, but the difference is China is not seeking to micromanage the internal affairs of recipient countries. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, you see, Jason, this is a nefarious Chinese plot to take over natural resources in the global south. I mean, that is a narrative that's being propagated right now because oftentimes in exchange for the Chinese build roads, ports, etc., many of these global South nations are using revenue sharing arrangement with their, for example, using mining rights or use collateral, use their natural resource revenue as collaterals for the loan. So I don't know what these pundits are expecting. I mean, this is just in terms of any kind of business business agreement, right? I mean, you to buy a house, you need to have to when you ask a loan, the bank for a loan to buy a house, for example, you will need to provide collaterals. This is just a part of doing business. And as you say, China is not China practice a non-interference foreign policy, which means China is just here doing business. It's not like United States or a European government is trying to impose terms on their bank loans. And this is what they don't like about Chinese loans, is because the Chinese loan is so-called no string attached. And now the African nations and the Southeast Asian nations, they have an alternative to the IMF and World Bank. If anything, competition is good. Now the African nations have a choice on which one to get the best terms. However, a lot of these media narrative about the so-called Chinese debt diplomacy, the underlying premises is that African leaders and African governments do not know what's in their best interest. It's these people who write for the Wall Street Journal or New York Times really know what's in the best interest of the Africans. I think that's ludicrous. I mean, it totally denies the agency to the people in the global South, and to imply that somehow these pundits who sit in the office in Washington or New York somehow know more about what's in the best interest of African is paternalistic, to say the least. I mean, I think there's also a tinge of racism there somewhere.
Well, I mean, it looks to me, based on my knowledge of the history of the IMF and World Bank, which, and I'm not trying to say are not useful. There may be places because, like you said, the agency of leaders in these developing nations sometimes do choose loans from IMF or World Bank or, Paris Club, all of these other organizations. So maybe there is a place for them, but it also looks like IMF and World Bank came into existence immediately after global independence movements. So at the same time as African nations were getting their independence from their former colonial lords, they were at the IMF and World Bank basically came into existence and created similar structures that existed in colonialism, using Africa and other underdeveloped nations as sources for raw materials so that those materials could be processed by the former colonial centers, Europe and America, to sell those goods at inflated prices back to the underdeveloped world. But I want to pivot a little bit, and because I saw that you did a few posts on the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and ask you, because this connects Gawdar, the deep water port on the coast of Pakistan, to Western China. What are the advantages for China? What are the advantages for Pakistan? What is the purpose of all of this infrastructure?
Right. So CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is one of the flagship projects of the BRI. China is investing tens and if not hundreds of billions of dollars into Pakistan, into building roads, bridges, power plants, basic infrastructure that the goal is, again, multifold. One is to help prop up the Pakistan economy. This will bring stability into the South Asia, in the subcontinent, and because China want a stabilizing neighborhood. Pakistan is neighbor of China. On the other side, because Pakistan is connected to China's Xinjiang region, development and economic prosperity of Pakistan will have a spillover effect into Xinjiang region of China. It also helps Xinjiang to develop by making this extra connection to the outside world. And the road, as you mentioned, it leads to the Pakistani port of Gawdar. Gawdar is set very close to the strategically located Persian Gulf. Gawdar is almost at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. And China currently imports most of its energy from the Middle East. China is one of the largest importer of the Middle East oil and gas. And most of the Chinese energy import come from is carried on on the ocean, through the Straits of Malacca, up the South China Sea into the Chinese ports. But the U.S. Navy made very clear that Strait of Malacca is a choking point. They will leverage against China in a scenario of war. U.S. Navy threatened to choke off China's energy supply. So by developing Gwadar, a port on near the mouth of Persian Gulf, and to potentially build a pipeline from Gwadar all the way across Pakistan, all the way feeds into China's Xinjiang region in the west, China bypassed the critical choking point of Malacca Strait. This is what the U.S. calls China's stream of pearl strategy. So instead of one single choking point where U.S. Navy can just park their ships, now there are many connection points China have with the rest of the world, and it will be impossible for U.S. Navy to spread. U.S. Navy will have to spread itself very thin, try to choke each individual points of connection. So the Belt and Road Initiative is not just has an economic impact. It also has a strategic design. The goal is to bypass that choking point at Malacca Strait and to have many different other points of contact for China to connect with the rest of the world.
Wow. Okay, so there are a lot of overland. So that what we're talking about with Gwadar is the maritime Silk Road, infrastructure and logistics for ports that move through ocean bodies. But there's also the Overland Silk Road, which are a series of rail lines that move from China through Russia and Kazakhstan to Eastern and Central Europe. I understand that shipping things over water is cheaper. So why all of the rail across the world island?
Right. So it's true. Shipping always cheaper than overland traffic. However, especially if you ship like a low cost commodity like sand, right? It's definitely cheaper to ship on big commodity freighters. However, for time sensitive manufactured goods such as laptops or cell phones, which China manufacture a lot, rail does become competitive because it's faster. It's faster and it's also cheaper than air. So there is a spot for rail traffic. It's just one additional. It's not supposed to replace the ocean traffic. It's not supposed to replace the seaborne trade. China is still the world's number one sea trading power, but the land link complements to whatever whatever linkage China have currently, because for example, a lot of the one of the strategy for China to develop its interior, because when China started open and reform, most of the industry were concentrated on the East Coast. And people would migrate from inland provinces like Sichuan or Gansu to places like Shenzhen in Guangdong and to work in the factories over there. What China is trying to do in the last 10 years to try to balance and distribute this development to the rest part of China to help with poverty alleviation effort in the inland China, to build up the capacity in inland China. So that's when we see Apple, for example, Apple iPhone plants gets built in the middle of China, I think in Henan, and then you have iPhones are being built in, you have laptops being built in Chongqing, for example, and all these inland cities, manufacturing centers, then will be linked by rail to Europe through this the belt part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and like I said, for these more expensive electronic products, rail is actually competitive versus water traffic.
So I'm trying to understand this actually. So is the reason that electronics are time sensitive because maybe all of the Huawei sell out in Belarus or something, and then it's like, oh, we need more right now because that's the sale is happening?
Well, I mean, the the ocean shipping takes a lot longer. With the electronics, 6 months is a long time. You're
Yeah, I guess so.
you're
Wow.
you're already due for an upgrade after 6 months. So you want to get to the market as soon as possible, right? So you don't want it to have your iPhone sitting on a ship for like a month on the water.
Mm, mm, mm. What is, China does have a policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations. Could you elaborate on your understanding of why China has this policy? I mean, let me give some background really quickly. We were talking about the Washington Consensus. There are economists in Washington, and I don't agree, but I'm just trying to kind of lay it out there, who believe that these liberalizing policies, or at least they claim they believe that these liberal policies that they sort of foist on developing countries will facilitate the growth of those economies where they're investing money. So why is China's policy to not have any asks, no strings attached, as you put it before, when they're involved in the economic development of underdeveloped countries?
Well, China is there to do business. I mean, China's policy is basically like, we don't care if we have ideological differences or political difference. Let's just sit down and do business. I mean,
Mm,
it's a very sensible policy. But China do uh, have a long formulated non-interference policy in their foreign policy goals. This dates all the way from to 1950s when Zhou Enlai has formulated the 5 principles of coexistence. Um, it's based on the respect for sovereignty. One of the uh, main tenets of sovereignty is you don't interfere in other countries' affairs, and
mm,
that's something that U.S. no longer, well, U.S. never really believed in, because
mm,
that limits the reach of the empire. But China is very strong believer in sovereignty, given the particular Chinese history in the last couple hundred years.
mm,
And so China understand the importance of sovereignty, and that you respect
mm.
other nations' choice, in their own implementation of their own national policies. But in the end, I mean, I think what makes Chinese policy attractive is, forget about everything else. Let's do business. I mean, I mean, like,
Right.
how that's just very pragmatic and sensible. And, despite all the effort of Western media trying to uh, tar and feather it, I think it's really hard to make such a pragmatic policy look bad. I mean, I think this reflects in the public opinions in the global South, of China versus U.S. China actually enjoy overwhelming positive
Mm,
uh, public opinions in the global South, much to the
mm.
surprise of maybe readership in the West.
I mean, there's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, Deborah Brautigam. I'm not sure if I'm saying her name right, but she defends exactly what you're saying all the time. She's the foremost U.S. expert on the Belt and Road Initiative, and she's constantly defending China, basically like there is no debt trap. But I kind of want to pivot again and talk a little bit about poverty alleviation in China. 800 million people lifted out of poverty. Could you tell us a little bit about one or two of the strategies or tactics that China used to accomplish this feat?
Yeah, we already touched it upon a little bit. One is through infrastructure development. Just build roads and bridges, and a lot of the areas in China, especially in inland China, the reason they were poor because they were limited by their geography. It's not very easily accessible, and by making them connected to this global marketplace, uh, it enables the enables the people to that I already talked about kind of the transfer of industrial capacity from the
Hmm.
East Coast to more inland. It makes sense in many fronts, because one, rather than people moving away from their family to go work 1,000 kilometers away, they can work closer to home. And by bringing jobs closer to where it's needed, it not only brings family together, but it also has an added benefit for the business of reducing costs, because of the land and labor is cheaper in inland China than it's on the East Coast, right? Because the East Coast has already been built out, and it just makes sense, and also it makes sense as a national policy, to just address poverty at a national level. You can't have hundreds of million people left behind while one small tiny section of your society is enjoying the first world comfort. That happened across many parts of the world, but that's not what Chinese government is trying to recreate. And that this is why Xi Jinping talk about the common prosperity. The common prosperity is sharing the wealth across the different layers and different social classes and different geographies of China.
Well, I want to address one or two of the concerns, or not concerns, criticisms of that. So
Sure.
I've heard, and I mean, I have my own reasons why I don't agree with these, but I want to hear yours. One of the criticisms is, oh, it's just they opened the market and this is capitalism bringing wealth to China. How would you address that?
Okay, so I will like to quote Deng Xiaoping. Back in 1980s, Deng Xiaoping says, socialism doesn't mean poverty. If we cannot feed and clothe our people, if we cannot provide our people with a good living standard and good prospect for the future, then we have failed. To prove the superiority of socialist system to the capitalist system, first of all, we have to provide our people with a good living, right? And I think China has done remarkably well in that aspect. I grew up in China in 1980s. I was born in 1976, so I witnessed firsthand the dramatic transformation of China in the last 40 years. There's a reason. There's an overwhelming support among the Chinese population for their government. Is because their government is actually delivering. They're delivering in providing a good life and good future for the majority of its citizens. So when people say, "Oh no, that's capitalism," that's not. I mean, I'm not a ideological person. I think it's just the goal of any government is a effective government, a good governance is to provide its people with good life. And I think that the Chinese government has done a remarkably good job doing that.
So China brokered peace recently between Saudi Arabia and Iran. How is China's role in the world changing?
Yeah, that's interesting because, as I mentioned, China had a very strict non-interference policy, which in a lot of instances means China keep a very low profile on the international stage. If people go look at China's voting record in the United Nations, for example, the most oftentimes, even in the instances where China might have disagreement, China choose abstain rather than outright veto, even though China is one of the 5 permanent the Security Council member. But the Saudi-Iran peace deal is a major tectonic shift in the Middle East, and China chose at this point to publicly host this meeting in Beijing and help to mediate between the both sides. That show that China is ready to have a more active foreign policy, and this is a quite contrast from the past. I quoted Deng Xiaoping earlier. Deng Xiaoping also said, keep a low profile and hide your strength, right? But I think it's too late now for China to hide its strength. I mean, Chinese strength is obvious for anyone to see. It doesn't make sense to try to keep a low profile and hope nobody notice China is now a great power. So might as well do something with it. And I think it's a very positive and very encouraging development that China is taking an active role in the Middle East peace negotiations. And right now, China is trying to do the same for Ukraine, which again, many of the Western pundit is pouring cold water, and even saying that China is not qualified to be objective mediator. But I mean, then who is? Would that be United States or NATO who is pouring weapons into Ukraine? I mean, things are just we're living in 1984 world where war is peace and everything is getting turned upside down in the mainstream media. I think that's why actually the mainstream media is actually losing a lot of credibility, not just in China but in U.S. as well, because a lot of the Americans can recognize bullshit is the kind of bullshit that's being piled on. So we are at a very critical juncture where we're at a crossroad where the U.S. empire continued to decline and China continued to rise, and I am very heartened to see that China taking an active role in peace negotiations. I mean, peace is always good, always better than the other alternative than the war. Right.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the purpose of this show for our American audience. We hope to help bridge understanding between China and not just America, but the West in general. So I wanted to ask you, we're both a little bit critical of international militancy, which seems to come from the West, from our perspective anyway. How would you say, what steps can China or the United States or the people in China or the people in the United States take to bridge a better understanding between our people and maintain peace and develop more cooperation, participation in the international community?
Right. The steps have to come from the other side, have to come from U.S. because China is not the one that's pushing for confrontation. China is open for business. Like China doesn't care. U.S. may have a different way of life or different different government structure. China is not going out the world trying to impose the Chinese model on everybody else. There's a common misconception is that China's rise will inevitably means that it's either the Chinese mode of governance or the U.S. mode of governance. That's not true. It's U.S. that's forcing people to choose. China just want to preserve its own way of life, and it also respect other countries for their own choices. So right now, China still very much would like to continue a productive partnership with anyone, including United States. Recently, the new Chinese ambassador to U.S. just made a statement to that effect that he hoped that U.S. and China can sit down and working as adults to working toward a more productive, cooperative relationship that will benefit the whole world. And he also pointed out the hostile relationship between the two doesn't benefit anyone. And so really, I mean, I think the ball is now in the court of Washington and in the so-called collective West to come to realization that coexistence is possible with China. It doesn't have to be you are either with us or against us. And this basically was the basis of the Sino-American relationship from the days of Nixon visit. At that time it was the Shanghai Communique was about preserve while we understand we agree to disagree, but we can still work on other important issues. And yeah, I'm a little bit more pessimistic on the government of United States because I feel like now the crazies are running the show. Um, for regular people, I think people to people exchange is very important. Like we're right now talking to each other. I think um, if more Americans would travel to China, to see what China is about, to talk to the Chinese people, they will, that will help to cast aside a lot of the common misconceptions, but hopefully they will also realize uh, it's foolish. It's foolish to have a confrontational relationship with China, and there's no reason for it. And this is my hope that more people will start questioning their government, why they're pursuing on such a policy.
Well, a lot of the anxiety seemed to come from the Trump administration. I'm neither Democrat nor Republican. I'm not trying to throw it out there, but it's only seemed this kind of overt hostility has only existed for the last 5 or 6, 7 years. Could this just be a hiccup in our relationship and things improve?
Biden administration had a window of opportunity when Biden take office and say, look, the Trump administration, that was just a fluke. Now we can get back to do business. But instead, the Biden administration has doubled down on the Trump policy toward China. I mean, the sanctions that Biden has levied on China on in terms of semiconductors is a lot more severe than whatever Trump ever levied against China. So right now, you know, to be tough on China is almost a bipartisan issue in Washington, which is very unfortunate, and because it's actually hurting even the U.S. companies, U.S. tech companies that's hoping to sell to China to continue, because China is one of their biggest market and growing. And now they're being locked out the Chinese market, not by Chinese government, but by U.S. government policies. And that's why you have the NVIDIA founder recently giving the talk that, once we lose China, the Chinese will eventually find a way to innovate themselves and to make those parts themselves. But once they do, they're not coming back. They're not going to come back to buy American products. We will then lose the Chinese market forever, which is a very important market. Like you said, there's not any replacement China around here. There's only one China. This is this giant marketplace, and if it will be a huge blow for the American tech companies to lose that market. And right now, that's what the Biden administration policy is it's doing. So I just hope people come to their senses. I don't know. I mean, at this point I'm fairly pessimistic, but I do hope. I like to keep the hope alive, and that maybe something will change.
You mentioned living in the United States for 30 years. I noticed that there is an increase in anti-Asian hate crime. I personally think that it has a lot to do with the anti-China rhetoric that comes from the media and from some of the leadership in Washington and elsewhere. Do you think that if China and the United States were able to de-escalate their political tensions or the economic tensions, the trade war, for example, that this kind of anti-Asian hate crimes could also be reduced?
Oh, sure. I mean, most definitely. I mean, mainstream media are trying to play down the linkage between the anti-Asian hate crime versus the U.S. xenophobic China policy. But for any reasonable person, you can see the linkage when a lot of when you're making China the enemy, a lot of the Chinese Americans are wearing the face of the enemy. So you are making them the target, and it is, because I have a U.S. passport, it's to my own advantage to see U.S. and China come to a more cooperative relationship. And I, so this is one of the reason I lash out online is because I'm very disappointed in the ways the things have the way things have turned out. But I do hope um, there will be a better term for the future, because if because the alternative is just too hard to contemplate. A confrontation between U.S. and China is potentially ruinous for the whole humanity. And that's
Well, I
that's just
have
a
to
hard
say,
reality.
I'm also very optimistic in terms of I don't think I certainly hope not. It does seem like the United States is out of control, but I feel like the United States knows that China has an incredible defensive capability. So there's no way that the United States could take actions beyond the trade war, beyond kind of sanctioning individuals or particular companies. It doesn't seem to me like viable that the United States could escalate things beyond the sort of um, moves against the free market that they've been making. And my feeling is immediately, like you say, the ball's in Washington's court. I completely agree. My opinion is that if the United States were to reduce some of the trade sanctions, some of the tariffs, China would immediately reciprocate, and we would have an instantaneously like de-escalating situation. And that it's entirely up to folks in Washington to take those actions, and we could end this sort of child's play that's been going on for the last few years, like overnight. And like, would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, definitely, 100%. The big question, the trillion-dollar question, is whether the leaders in Washington will come to their senses.
I want to go back and connect two other things that we were talking about. So we were talking about the end of absolute poverty in China. So with the Belt and Road Initiative, do you think that it's possible that China can replicate some of the model of its own success in other nations? Because beyond just building like a hydropower dam in Laos or something like that, or the rail that's running through to Gawdar from Western China, China's not just building, for example, logistics. It's building an energy. It sends agronomists, professional scientists to other countries. It looks at what kind of things will grow there. It makes recommendations for growing different kinds of produce or rice, or offers kinds of technical advice on how to how to increase economic activity. Is it possible that China's record for ending absolute poverty within China's own borders can be replicated elsewhere? What do you think?
Well, I would just cite the statistics. There was a chart of the total GDP growth from 1992 to the present. And if you look at the chart, the fastest growing economy, number one is China, of course.
Mm.
Number one is Vietnam.
I
And
saw
and
that.
if you
I
yes,
was
and if
very
you look at
surprised.
yeah, Vietnam is actually, I think, probably closest to China in terms of um, both political culture, government structure, and and whole other variety of factors. I think that hopefully that answers your question.
Hmm. So, yeah, okay. Then there is hope that we're going to see the underdeveloped world, which has spent centuries being underdeveloped by the former colonial powers, come into a kind of modernity of their own and infrastructure, better lives and stuff. I mean, one of the things that I think came out of the Iran Saudi Arabia deal that I was most happy about was the end of the conflict in Yemen. I think
Yes.
whether you're American hardcore war hawk or whatever, I assume at least most people want what's in the best interest of most other people. Um, People disagree dramatically about how to get there, but I would hope that global poverty, absolute poverty, could be something that ends before I check out. Anyway, any last thoughts? Oh, I do have a question for you. This is kind of not political. What happened with your Twitter account? I think a lot of people are interested because you were like selling iPads or something for a couple weeks there.
My Twitter account was hacked for about 2 weeks, and it's it was I accidentally clicked on a phishing link, and that led to my myself getting locked out of my account. The hacker took over, then using my Twitter account to sell laptop scam. And I did recover my Twitter account after 2 weeks, and it was an uphill battle because I couldn't get in touch with a real person when I filed the support ticket. I only get automated replies, and it was only what a friend of mine, Daniel Dumbrill, thank you, Daniel,
Yeah.
who tracked down a real person who worked at the Twitter. This is very ironic because it came about because Matt Walsh got hacked. And then Ben Shapiro tweeted about Matt Walsh being hacked. So then we got some action from Twitter. A Twitter person, Ella, actually responded to that tweet thread. And that's when my friend Daniel Dumbrill replied to Ella, hey, can you please take a look at the case of my friend? Hacker is using his large account to promote laptop scam. So that's how my Twitter account got resolved.
Well, we're glad to have you. The entire community was very happy to get you back. The idea of rebuilding you on another account was terrifying. Honestly, I saw what was happening to you, and I was like, I hope this does not happen to me or other people in our community. So it's good to have you back.
Turn on your two-factor authentication. I did have my two-factor authentication turned on, but it was via text message. And then back then, Elon Musk turned off the two-factor authentication via text message for people who didn't pay for Twitter Blue. And so don't use two-factor authentication via SMS. Use a Google Authenticator, and that is much better, much safer. And Elon at least has not turned it off, that free option. So do that.
I got it. Well, also I'll keep Daniel in mind if something happens in the future. Also,
yes.
So I guess he's going to be the go-to person for anyone who's having a crisis. Any last thoughts you wanted to leave with our listeners before we go?
I maybe I was sounding overly pessimistic in this interview, but I still have great hope for the future. I don't know how it will come about, but I think eventually U.S. and China will have to learn to work with each other and to work for the betterment of humanity. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Well, I hope so too. Thank you so much for joining us, Carl. And if you guys are looking for Carl Jha, please find Silk and Steel Podcast, or you can find him at Carl Jha, CarlZha. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Jason.
Hello.